Welcome to this short webinar about blended learning in vocational training. My name is Dominik Hassler and I work at the University of Teacher Education in Zürich, Switzerland, in the Center for Vocational and Adult Education. Now in this webinar we are going to talk a little bit about what is blended learning, what can it be, what do we understand in blended learning, and what are some of the success factors, what are some of the advantages and benefits it can bring, and what are some of the risks and disadvantages that come with it, and how we might deal or mitigate some of those disadvantages. So let's get started. Now first, let's look at what is blended learning. And I have here a few dimensions of blended and hybrid formats. And the first dimension is from synchronous to asynchronous. And that means we have in synchronous physical presence or virtual presence. And in asynchronous, that means we have self-study or homework, so students are working not at school, but at home or on their own time. And usually today we call this mix between physical and virtual presence hybrid, but it's really not a definition. You could call this also blended learning, and that is a bit of the disadvantages of the term blended learning. You can understand basically everything under blended learning, because blend only means it's a mix between things. So it could be a mix between physical and virtual presence. It could be a mix between synchronous and asynchronous learning. It could be a mix between working digitally and analog. It could be a mix of people having a traditional class, and some of those students are working with a bring your own device laptop, and some of those work with paper. You could even call that blended learning. What exactly we understand with blended learning, we're going to talk about in the next slide. Let's just finish this model here. And if you mix all these three options together, so that learners can choose if they want to attend in physical presence, or that they want to attend from home in the virtual presence, or that they want to watch the lecture later and do the tasks associated with it on their own time asynchronously, then we would call this the high flex learning model, which obviously is the most difficult one or complex one, but offers the biggest flexibility and freedom for learners to choose what and how they want to learn. Now let's look a little bit differently on this question. We again have here in this model from asynchronous to synchronous, and we have from physical presence to at home. And now let's look where would typical learning methods or settings fall into. And the traditional classroom we would have at the bottom here between physical presence and synchronous. And at the top we have self-study. So this is asynchronously and at home. Which also oftentimes is called homework. Now, if you mix those two together, that traditional classroom and studying at home, you could call this flipped classroom, you could call this homework, and you could also call this blended learning. And this is one part that we understand at the right now in blended learning in this presentation. Now, the other thing that I would name here, want to mention here, is the webinar, which is students are usually at home and taking part synchronously in this webinar. And on the left side here we have the self-directed studying in the physical presence, so that means inside the school building. They are here, but they are studying self-directed asynchronously, and we would also call this blended learning. So this is the focus of the GBSSG in Switzerland, to have their students study in this blended learning setting. They get missions and learning paths that they complete in groups or alone at their own pace, in their own time. Just to make this complete, we also have here hybrid, where we have a mix between physical presence and at home, but it's always synchronous. And we have here the recorded webinar, which is always at home, but it's synchronously or asynchronously. And as we mentioned before, if you can choose between all the forms, we have here the high flex model of learning. these two last fields I left empty. You could theory craft something that would perhaps fit into this, but it's really rare that something fits exactly into one of these two spots and is not actually high flex or self-directed learning. So we are going to leave those empty for now. Now ask yourself this, what does blended learning mean at your institution or organization, or what does it mean for you? And is there a uniform understanding at your institution, or are there differing interpretations of it and that maybe need clarification? Now here we have another perspective on this topic by Claudia Bremer. And this really goes from physical presence to virtual, or from more analog to digital. And it starts with enrichment, where we have a physical presence that is mandatory, and there are some accompanying materials like scripts, slides, or learning media such as videos, and maybe a discussion forum, although those are a bit outdated maybe nowadays. And in the middle we have the integration, where the online elements are no longer optional. You do have to complete those in order to have the desired learning outcome. And on the right side we have the virtualization, where there is no physical presence anymore. It's purely online. Oftentimes this is video lectures, and oftentimes those are completely self-paced courses or MOOCs. Now let's look at, in the enrichment, we have a few tools here that usually are used, like mails and chats, or chat rooms or chat groups. And we have usually something that is a collaboration tool, perhaps an online pinboard, or we work together in a cloud. With the integration, we usually have a lot of self-study materials that are delivered digitally or online. And students do have to complete those. It could also be that this is a text, could also be that this is a video, and could also be that after watching a video or reading a text, you solve some exercises, you have a quiz that you can complete for a self-evaluation, so that you know if you have understood the material or if you have to go over it again. And in this integrative format that I would call also blended learning right now, it's critical that there's an interlocking that is consciously designed between the online and the physical phases. So if you give them a task to do online, like reading a text, watching a video, solving some exercises, and this is not picked up on in the physical presence, then students are unlikely to complete these tasks, and they won't have the knowledge necessary to follow the lesson. Or of course you gave them a text to read that was not even necessary to read. So in any case, you should really design this very, very consciously for the learning of your students. And in the virtualization department, we have the options to have these self-paced courses to be supported by tutors. It's also possible to have some synchronous elements. For example, if they have to do some collaborative group work, you could have them meet, for example, at Wednesday afternoon online. And also this usually enables lecturers to offer office hours, where students can have a one-to-one exchange with a learning coach or lecturer, ask questions, and so on. Now here we have some statistics about asynchronous online learning, and one of the advantages is really that learners are able to learn faster when learning asynchronously. And this is basically because they don't have to follow the pace of the lecturer. Usually the lecturer is a bit too fast or a bit too slow, and this is not efficient for students. So some of the students have to wait, and some of the students who are a bit slower, they at some point won't be able to keep up anymore. And at this point, when they lose track, then they can't follow anymore, and the rest of the lecture basically is wasted. So in a asynchronous online learning setting, they can press pause, they can go back a little bit, repeat something until they understood it, so they can follow the material much more efficiently. So they don't learn more in this asynchronous online setting, but they learn it more efficiently. Also, data indicates that learners really prefer asynchronous online learning over synchronous online learning. Synchronous online learning seems to be the most tedious for students. There's also a huge drawback, and that is in an asynchronous online learning setting, you tend to lose more students than in synchronous online learning settings or in the physical presence. So, what is blended learning? In my own words, I would call blended learning the mix of from the best of both worlds, and I would design this mix with a focus on effectiveness so that learners can learn at their own pace and get the most out of it. And when we are in the physical presence, then learners should really be active and integrated into the learning process. And essentially, inevitably, there has to be some transfer of responsibility to learners when you try or want to work in a blended learning setting. So essentially, blended learning is about great instructional design. You have, as a lecturer, to know your students, yourself, and the course material all very well. And then based on that knowledge, you can create an ideal mix of tools and methods and learning media in order to support your learners. That would be ideal. Now, I would like for you to ask yourself this: what are the factors that determine the quality and success of your blended learning scenario? And also, what are your or your institution's reasons and motivations behind the plan to practice blended learning? Why do you want to do that? And I have a little decision tree here, which form of blended learning might be suited for vocational training. So we have asynchronous at home, we have synchronous at home, physical presence, and mixed synchronous. And asynchronous at home really only works if your students are used to do homework consistently. And if your students are used to do homework consistently, then yes, asynchronous blended learning is a possibility. If not, blended learning might not be an ideal choice. So if your students don't like, enjoy, or really do homework reliably, then you probably shouldn't opt for a asynchronous at-home blended learning setting. So for the synchronous at home, you really need to have some organizational or didactical reason why you want that. So one reason could be your students have a very long commute and it takes them a long time to arrive at school. That might be an organizational reason that would justify to do some lessons or days synchronously at home, but this has a lot of challenges. So if you have from 8 to 10 your topic 1 and this one is online or synchronous at home, and the topic from 10 to 12 is in physical presence, this is not going to work because your students won't have time. So it's an all or nothing approach basically for the whole day. That might pose some challenges to your organization. So you really need to have some pressing reasons, like for example, a pandemic to opt for this. So if you have a good reason, then synchronous blended learning is certainly possible and otherwise not ideal. So the physical presence is like a little bit the traditional presence with usually a bring your own device. And yes, you can call this blended learning still. And yes, that usually would probably be a good idea to practice. As for the mixed synchronous, so to speak, the hybrid setting, also you have to ask yourself, are there any organizational and or didactical reasons why you really want to have this setting? Again, a pandemic, some students are sick, or some students have a very long commute, might be reasons to do that, but usually this does create so much more work and difficulty for your teachers and lecturers that you have to ask yourself, does this pay off? So yes, if you do have an organizational reason, then you have to ask yourself, do you have the resources to pay your teachers and also to have a a room and technical setup that is suited for hybrid or mixed synchronous settings. And if you also can answer this question with yes, then yes, mixed blended learning is possible, and otherwise I would not suggest doing that. Now, please ask yourself, what are some of the challenges a blended learning setting would pose to you, your institution, and your students? And might I suggest that one of those challenges might be that some or many of your students might arrive unprepared, not having done the homework reliably enough so that you can actually proceed with the lesson as planned. And what would you do in that case? How would you deal with that situation? And aside from how you would deal with that, what other options would you have to deal with that? And we're going to look at this in the discussion. There are a lot of different ways that are very dependent on the context of you and your institution that you can do or not do. So this ranges from very low impact at all to a very strong impact, and it could be a negative to a positive reaction. So please think about what options do you have. Maybe you want to put them inside a bracket like this. Maybe you just want to have a few bullet points, and we're going to talk about this. Now, there are a few things you can do to increase the probability of your students preparing. And the first thing is that you have to communicate expectations very, very clearly to increase the commitment on obligation. So the issue is your students have been in school for a long time, and homework usually has been optional to do, and they arrive in your class and your lesson with that mindset. So it's not enough that you tell them once that they really do have to do the homework in your class, or in your case, you have to repeatedly make this very clear and also explain why in your blended learning setting this is so important. So the second thing you can do is to integrate content and activities from the out-of-class phase into the in-class phase, but do not repeat in an input. So if you give them the task to read a text or watch a video, you absolutely must not repeat that, because students will very quickly stop doing that. And ideally, aside from a input or a text or video, you would also give them a task that would make their learning process visible. That could be that they have to make a summary of a mind map. That could be that they have to find examples from their life or their work or anything like that from their own world that would that they can note or visualize. That would be very helpful and increase the probability, because watching a video is invisible, and if you don't give them a task to actually make this visible, there is little inhibition to not do that homework. Also, try to find something that is interesting for your students and embed the activity in something that is from your students' world and work or life. And also, less is more. Try not to give too long inputs or tasks for the at-home part. That would also increase the chance of your students actually doing that work.